President Trump touting the U.S. coronavirus testing at the daily White House briefing today.
Hey there, Allison.
NBC News political reporter Jane Timm joins me now. And Jane, the president reiterating his confidence in the U.S. testing system. Here's what he said.
We're a big nation. When you look at us compared to others, when you see how we've taken testing from a broken system that I inherited to having the best tests that anyone's made anywhere in the world, and other countries are calling us, wanting to use our technology.
Jane, how does testing in the U.S. compare to what we're seeing in the rest of the world?
So it's a novel theory to say that he inherited a broken testing system for a novel coronavirus. The virus emerged last year. We had no testing system before it did. He did not, or something that hamstrung him about testing with this new virus. The U.S. actually had a troubled time developing a test to find this virus, and it took them a while to get it out there. It's something that experts say really hamstrung the U.S.'s efforts to stop this. And he says, we're doing more testing than anybody else, which is true. We've done about 2 million tests already, but per capita, that's not as much as a lot of other countries. You look at South Korea, I think they just passed 500,000 tests today, and they have 51 million people. That's 1 in every 102 residents, whereas we're testing something more like 101 in every 160 residents. So it's just a different amount per capita, which is really an irrelevant measure here.
Jane, the president expressed confidence that recovered patients develop immunity to the virus. What do we know about that so far?
Yeah, so he was going on and he said, when you've had the virus and you recover and maybe you only had a few sniffles, you're immune, which would be great. We're all really hoping that we'll have a lot of immunity when people recover from this, but we just don't know when it comes to this virus. And he said later in the briefing that it could be a year or it could be forever, like the chickenpox, but we don't even know if it's a week at this point. Right now, we know that you develop antibodies after you've had this virus. You can measure those antibodies, but we don't know the protective value of those antibodies. And there's lots of researchers looking at this, so I'm sure we'll know soon-ish, but we can't say there's absolute immunity and it could be at least a year. That's a best case scenario, that there's long-term immunity, and we don't know that yet.
Jane, the president's also been pushing the malaria drug hydroxychloroquine as a coronavirus treatment. There's been some debate about that recommendation. What have we seen with it so far?
So here's the thing. This is a really old drug. It's been around for decades, and it's used in a lot of different people, be it lupus patients, rheumatoid arthritis patients, as an anti-malarial, as you said. But we don't know how well it works on coronavirus patients. There's been anecdotal evidence that it can be very helpful, particularly when you give it to a patient early in the course of their disease. We've seen a couple of small studies, but scientists call those anecdotal evidence, that we don't know from a big study with a lot of different people actually how effective it might be. And the president talks about it a lot. It's led to stockpiling, and it's led to shortages for people who take this medicine and need it every day for proven abilities. So when you listen to Dr. Fauci talk about hydroxychloroquine, you hear a very different story than when you hear the president talk about it. He often says it's an approved treatment, which it's not. It's approved for things like lupus. It's not approved to deal with coronavirus. There is no proven treatment for coronavirus yet.
Jane Timm, our friendly fact checker, thanks so much for being with us this week. I hope you have a safe and healthy weekend.
You too, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.